In this TV Crazy Man video, I take a look at one of my favorite shows of all time, and behind the scenes, plot, and visual goofs one notices when watching reruns of a series like The Adventures of Superman for like decades. That and a little research goes a long way. So let's get started, Superman fans.
Nothing'll ever hurt it, Clark. Not acid, nor fire, nor nothing else.
Now, Clark's adopted earthly mother tells him that the costume she made him was created from the Kryptonian blanket he wrapped to Earth with, and that it's indestructible. She says nothing on Earth can destroy it, but then how was she able to sew and cut it into the shape of his costume? In the episode The Stolen Costume, the crooks try to burn and then cut it with scissors, and they fail at both, proving Superman's costume cannot be altered, sewn, or cut.
You can't cut it neither.
In my original Goose video, y'all pointed out in the comments correctly that Martha Kent had Superman's help to sew the costume by use of his heat vision in the comics. Keep in mind though, this wasn't mentioned on the TV series. Also on a trivia note, the Kents even had different names on the TV series. Martha was Sarah and Jonathan was Eben on the show. The parents of Superman didn't settle on their names until sometime between 1950 and 51. They also went by John and Mary Kent before that time. In the very first episode, Superman saves a man that's falling to his doom. Man's played by Dabbs Greer, who played on the Lost Prairie as the preacher. When Superman catches him, it's very easy to notice that it's actually a dummy. Now on the episode The Haunted Lighthouse, you might be tempted into thinking you're seeing a ghost to your right, but it's really shadows of the actress that's playing Jimmy Olsen's aunt on the backgrounds that are supposed to be empty space. The shadow really gives it away. Otherwise, being in black and white, you may never have realized it's a fake background. Now in the episode Night of Terror, there's a report from a couple of different sources that I read that Phyllis Coates, Lois Lane, was off her mark during one scene and accidentally took the full brunt of a punch by one of the actors, Frank Richards, and was actually knocked out. According to what I read, the scene was not even reshot. They didn't have enough time. But the actor did apologize profusely. But I slowed down the scene, and to me, it looks like that his fist missed her face completely, then she fell. It was pointed out to me in the comments on my original first season Goose video, and rightly so, that the actress may have accidentally gotten an elbow to the face instead of the actor's fist. It does look like that's a possibility. Okay, in the final fight scene of Night of Terror, there's a few things we might consider as goofs that are seen here. First, there are full-face views of an obvious Superman stunt double. The bad guy strikes Superman with his knife later, which appears to be a really cheap prop, and it bends like paper, and you can see where the knife is bent before he even touches Superman. Now, when Superman strikes the final blow against babyface Stevens in the cabin, as Stevens falls backwards out of the shot, he can be heard saying "ow" really loud, followed shortly by a much quieter GD. Now in this shot, it's not a stuntman, it's George Reeves. Maybe he actually hit him, or more likely maybe he fell outside of the picture and got hurt somehow. But it's amazing that this made it to 1950s television and nobody was aware. Now, in the Mind Machine episode, I actually think this next scene is really cool for its day especially. When Superman takes off to fly after the bus, there's a quick cut to Superman leaving the ground on wires, and it's obviously a stunt double if you slow it down especially. And if you look closely, you can see the wires. Now, I read that previously during filming, George Reeves was doing a similar stunt himself and the wires broke, causing Reeves to fall to the ground and hurt himself pretty badly. He apparently refused to hang by wires after that. Now, I really think they were onto something though here. I mean, it's neat how they made the dust kick up as he takes off. The Christopher Reeve movies would later perfect the art of using wires to make Superman fly. But at this point, the previous Superman, Kirk Allen, had even resorted to using a cartoon for flying scenes. So yeah, these guys were pioneers of special effects flying scenes, and I think they should have kept going with the wires and maybe figured out a way for George Reeves to be safe so that they could have used him instead of the stuntman in the scene. Now later on, they relied mainly on Reeves leaping on springboards to simulate him taking off in flight. You can see in the episode The Evil 3, the springboard is actually visible when Reeves leaps off into the air. Here's one everybody remembers, where Superman has been shot at with no effect. He decides to duck when the bad guy throws the gun in frustration. This was actually Reeves' stunt double, Dale Van Sickle, who ducked. This mistake happened in The Mind Machine. Of course, normally Superman would not duck when the bad guy throws the gun at him. In the episode Czar of the Underworld, in every scene where Superman is seen carrying this mobster, it's quite obvious that it's just a dummy. This is most apparent when he carries him into the building and hits the dummy's head against the door. I hope you're enjoying the video so far. Please hit the like and comment and let me know what you think about the video. Thanks. In the episode Perry White's Scoop, when Jimmy Olsen climbs up into a water tank, the painted background of the city has a visible fold running horizontally through it. Now, in one scene, Clark Kent and Perry White are locked in a couple of steamers by some bad guys, and White passes out. Clark Kent busts out of the steamer, and the wooden top basically blows up and whacks White in the side of the head. Now check out the look on his face that he makes while he's supposedly passed out. Now in the episode A Ghost for Scotland Yard, you can see a tow cable is visible attached to the front end of a runaway car while Superman is trying to stop the vehicle. Now, one of the more simpler goofs in the area plot was the question, how did the Daily Planet staff not recognize Clark Kent was Superman, even at those times when he wasn't wearing his glasses?
What did you call me? Mr. Kent? Who? What's the matter? Don't any of you know me?
Now in this scene from 5 Minutes to Doom, Clark rips off his glasses before jumping out of the car. After a bomb explodes, he and Lois are standing face to face, yet she doesn't recognize him as Superman. Now this happened again in the episode Panic in the Sky. Now after attempting to destroy an asteroid, Superman returns to Earth without his memory. When Perry White, Lois Lane, and Jimmy Olsen see Clark Kent at his apartment, they don't recognize him as Superman, even though he doesn't have his glasses on.
Wake up. You're a reporter. You work for me. Now come on, stop this.
Am I? Are you sure? Who is Superman?
Now this could be a pretty big goof. I mean, you got 3 investigators that can't recognize that Clark and Superman are the same guy, even though they've seen him many times as Superman, and they work with him on a daily basis in his Clark Kent disguise. There is an explanation that we have from the comics, but that was years later in the late 70s. Superman issue 330, it explained that Superman uses super hypnotism to unconsciously make others see Clark as weak and unhealthy looking, completely different looking than Superman. This would actually make everything make sense.
I don't know. I'm pretty confused.
So am I, Lois. So am I.
Keeping that in mind, there's at least one episode I remember in Season 6, Episode 2, The Magic Secret. Superman hypnotizes and actually levitates Lois Lane. But strangely enough, Perry White had also been able to do this super trick on Lois. Okay, now back to the episode Panic in the Sky. When Superman flies to the asteroid, you can see a wire that's attached to him. When Superman lands on the asteroid with a bomb, if you listen carefully, you can hear birds twittering in the background.
No matter who I am. Here goes.
Now, when Superman's flying towards the asteroid, we see the Earth represented by the use of a globe. And there's a piece of cloth under the globe on your right side that can be seen that starts to disappear right during the shot. The string holding up the asteroid is visible. Now, in the episode Semi-Private Eye, after the bad guys throw down gas canisters and leave the room, the gas begins to fill the air, and Jimmy and Lois and Garrity begin choking. And just as Garrity pulls out his handkerchief to cover his mouth and nose, a crewman's head is briefly visible on the lower left, managing the stage fog. Now, honestly, I don't know with the TV screens as they were shaped back in the 50s whether or not this would be been visible or not. Just a quick timeout. My name's Tim Frady, and if you've been in my channel, you know very often I'm a writer and an artist, and I have lots of books at Amazon. I got a new superhero book called Liberty Ace. I got some funny stuff called Caveman Comics. I've got some sci-fi novels called The Time Cruisers. I'd really appreciate it if you took the time to check them out on Amazon. And if you like what you read, maybe even give me a review. Really appreciate it. It means a whole lot. Well, thanks, and let's keep on with the video. In the episode Star of Fate, look at Superman. He's about to take off here. Do you notice anything weird? Superman's S is reversed, meaning the footage was mirrored. Now let's go back real quick to A Ghost for Scotland Yard. Now here's a really fun scene. The comic book that the news vendor gives Jimmy in the very last scene is Superman number 83 from 1953. The main story is entitled Clark Kent Convict. Now here's the goof. If Jimmy Olsen would have read the comic book the news vendor gave him, he would know that Clark Kent is Superman, as the cover clearly gives away Superman's secret identity. Now don't get me wrong, I think this is really awesome, having a Superman comic within a Superman show. In fact, I'm going to try and get my hands on this book now just to add to my collection. I mean, it may cost me a pretty penny, but just think about having the same comic book that was in a scene with George Reeves himself. Now that is pretty cool.
Great Caesar's ghost.
So let's get started into the first season that The Adventures of Superman was presented in color in season 3.
Golly, what'll Superman do now?
I don't know, Jimmy. I don't know.
In a very funny episode, The Bully of Dry Gulch, Lois and Jimmy are up against some mean cowboys in a town that looks like it came out of a TV Western. In one outdoor scene, the same woman wearing a red shirt keeps popping up. Here she comes the first time. She looks like she is genuinely curious as to what these dudes are doing here. Here she is again a few seconds later, but now she somehow got way back behind Jimmy. Is this lady like a ghost or an alien? How did she get way back there? Here she comes again. She's still looking really curious. I wonder if she was an alien observer that is able to teleport across time and space. Now, I mentioned this episode is really funny. This isn't necessarily a goof by the strictest of definitions, but I have to mention this scene in this episode that you could say is very unlike Superman, as we normally see of him. But then again, it's probably representative of what Superman is thinking throughout this series. Clark's on the phone with Lois, and she keeps trying to tell him that Jimmy Olsen is in trouble.
Jimmy's in jail and he's going to be shot at sundown.
Lois, I'm very busy.
He's not really interested.
And he's gunning for Jimmy.
Tell him to go on a diet. He'll be harder to hit.
Until she mentions, well, listen for yourself. It cracks me up every time I see it.
Besides putting Jimmy in jail, this character's been making goo-goo eyes at me.
He's been doing what?
Yeah, you can throw Jimmy Olsen in jail, but brother, when you make googly eyes at Lois Lane, it's on.
That's different. I'll be right out.
Now, in the episode The Talking Clue, Superman is covered in plaster dust when he busts through a wall. And a moment later, he's totally clean. Must be one of those superpowers that we didn't know about. We talked about before how George Reeves' Stuntman ducked when the bad guys threw his gun at Superman after he ran out of bullets in the first season, and how Reeves normally would just let the gun hit him. But in the third season, as if Reeves were acknowledging the first season goof, he seems to always grab the gun out of the bad guy's hands before they can throw it at him. Now again, in the episode The Talking Clue, the outside of the police station is shown a couple of times in this episode. The same two cars are parked outside, and the same cop is riding his tricycle in the same direction. Now you could say that they were just reusing the same film footage, or my theory is that this was an incident with a time loop. In the episode Through the Time Barrier, Superman gets stuck in prehistory, unable to get back to the present thanks to Winnie the Pooh. Well, I should say the voice of Winnie the Pooh, actor Sterling Holloway, who in this episode is a scientist named Professor Twiddle, who happens to have invented a time machine that only sends people back in time.
Here we go.
But he got so excited he forgot to figure out how to get them back to the present. Of course, they make it back eventually, but not through the use of Superman's powers. In the comics, Superman can break the time barrier. However, Superman tries and fails to do so in this episode.
But I can't crack the time barrier.
And Superman had time traveled in the comics as far back as the 40s. So strictly speaking, this could be considered a goof. But then, of course, television and movies never mirror the comics perfectly.
Well, what's the trouble? Didn't you ever see a caveman before?
Speaking of Superman not using his powers the same way you would in the comic books, in the episode The Lucky Cat, why doesn't Superman use his super breath to put out the fire? And before anybody gets upset with me, I did say that I was going to be nitpicking.
What have I done to deserve you?
You're just lucky, I guess.
Acme Department Store. I have some things he bought.
In the episode Olsen's Millions, there's an Acme department store delivery man who's dressed more like a bellhop for some reason. In the episode Superman Week, Superman poses for a painting which is actually based on a previous publicity photo George Reeves had done. This is actually the same photo that was used for a Season 1 DVD cover decades later.
Goodbye, miss.
You can consider this next one a goof or just a reality of a TV show working with a tight budget. Check out this scene of Superman jumping out of the Daily Planet window right after changing from his Clark Kent disguise. They used this same scene several times in the series. In the episode The Talking Clue, they used it to represent a window in Inspector Henderson's building. I think they must have used the same window and room to represent various different locations for Superman to land and take off in. Here it appears to be again on the episode Lucky Cat. They've just added a few things to make it look like someone's office. Here it is again on the episode Superman Week as an apartment for a painter. The door's missing, but the window seems to line up with the Daily Planet's window. I think they just added a wall and some curtains to create a new room here. Here it is again on the episode Olsen's Millions. So either they used the same kind of window a lot for different rooms, or they just used the same room and changed it out over and over again.
Don't all of you treat me as though I were going crazy?
Thanks, pal. No one, but no one can do the things that Superman does. And that goes especially for flying.
First, let's take a look at the episode Peril by the Sea. I want to mention the guest star because he is one of my favorite actors to see on screen. Claude Akins plays Ace Miller, the bad guy of this episode. He brings a gritty, realistic feel that's more in tune with the first couple of seasons. He was a pretty tough actor who was great at playing the heavy. Of course, I'll always think of him as the comedic Sheriff Lobo who hassled BJ and the Bear. In this episode, Superman is flying through the ocean to stop a torpedo. The sound effect is the same whooshing sound as when he flies through the air. That whole scene is for me the worst scene from the entire series. Looks like Superman is flying inside a toilet bowl, or big sink. I guess this is one of those times when the lack of budget and time really hurt the special effect. Here's one I have a question about. Is that when Superman demands that Akins' character, Ace Miller, surface his submarine and give himself up, how did Ace hear Superman's voice underwater inside the submarine?
Surface, come into port and give yourselves up. Don't try anything funny, I'll be watching you.
Did they have microphones on periscopes back then so that you could hear what was going on the outside? If they didn't, I guess, Superman could have used his super ventriloquism from the comics to push his voice through the water and into the submarine. That's all I can think of.
I can't come into this room because of the kryptonite. Now, I've got a weed burner here I found in the tool shed. I'm going to try and burn the kryptonite up.
In the Deadly Rock episode, Superman can't untie Jimmy and Lois because of kryptonite in the room. Here's the goof. Why could Superman not just use his heat vision or heated X-ray vision as it was presented in this series to incinerate the kryptonite rock in the fireplace instead of going to look for a weed burner? Were they saying Superman's heat vision was useless against kryptonite? Doesn't seem quite right. He should have been able to destroy it from a distance, I would think. In the episode The Big Freeze, a mad scientist figures out how to freeze Superman, stealing all his powers. But Superman can still walk and talk. But the funny thing is, his cape still flutters freely in the air, even though it's been frozen. Seems like they could have gotten a cape that was stiff for this one, maybe used a lot of starch. Previously, a ball that was frozen by the same process became hard and brittle and burst into 1,000 pieces. Now in the episode The Girl Who Hired Superman, when Superman jumps from the floor up to the mantel over the fireplace, his cape moves upward, and this reveals that the film was actually run backwards. A few seconds later, they run it forward when Superman jumps down. I'm pretty sure they used the same method a lot for other shows in later decades, like The $6 Million Man and The Bionic Woman. but they didn't have capes to give it away. There's another moment in this episode that I loved as a kid. How many of y'all were amazed when Superman tore the phone book twice? I guess I was thinking, of all the things that Superman did, this might be the one thing that I could pull off someday.
No one, but no one can do the things that Superman does.
In the episode Unlucky Number, a crook named Dexter is shot on the porch with an automatic weapon. He was unharmed due to use of a metal plate under his shirt. The problem is he has no holes in his shirt right after being shot, which seems kind of weird. There's a fun scene in this episode where Superman, Superboy, and Batman comic books can be seen at a newsstand. Now this happened once before in season 2. Is Superman so popular he got his own comic book in his own world? I'm calling it a goof just so I can have an excuse to point it out. I think it's pretty neat having Superman and his comic books exist in the same world.
Hold it.
In the episode Joey, there's two thugs that show up at a corral where Lois and Jimmy and Clark are at to harm a racehorse. They stand almost in plain view of Lois, but she doesn't say anything about him. And it's also strange that with Superman's super hearing, he doesn't hear the thugs talking to each other as they're planning their evil deeds. And they're so close that anybody could hear them.
No chance to use this. Not with them hanging around all night.
We don't have to. I knew someday I might have to resort to this.
Clark, what are you going to do?
In the episode The Jolly Roger, Clark is faced with a situation where it seems there's no way to change into Superman without exposing his true identity. This is yet another moment that Clark Kent removes his glasses in front of Jimmy and Lois, but neither recognize him as Superman. Having noticed this several times since I've been doing the Goofs videos, I have to agree with some of the comments that this is probably an intentional running gag. Has to be. Having said that though, I think that Clark could literally change clothes right in front of them and Lois would still be like, "Where did Clark go?" And Jimmy would be like, "Golly, Miss Lane, he was just here a minute ago." Hey, classic TV fans, if you like silly but family-friendly books that you don't have to worry about your kids and grandkids reading, then check out my Caveman Comics book series. Please don't forget to subscribe and comment and like and
believe me, it'll be a pleasure.
Hey, Superman fans, glad you stopped in.
What are you stopping for?
The episode The Town That Wasn't has an interesting storyline. In it, Jimmy Olsen is the victim of a scam where a small group of criminals put up a phony town speed trap, along with a phony town, that they move every week.
This is the rock I tripped over when the officer pushed me into the courtroom.
What officer? What courthouse?
But the question is, with only 3 able-bodied men and the older phony judge played by Dick Elliott, aka Mayor Pike from the Andy Griffith Show, how could they move the town overnight? I can handle believing a man can fly, but not 3 non-superpowered individuals moving a jail, a courthouse, and a large diner every week within a day or so.
Ridiculous. You don't take a town apart.
I wasn't too sure of that, Bill.
It doesn't make the episode any less enjoyable, but a little more of an explanation would have been nice. The other plot issue I have is, wouldn't people notice a small town disappearing and reappearing? I mean, something like that would be a thing of legend, like the Bermuda Triangle or the Philadelphia Experiment, which I wrote about, by the way, in my Tom Cruiser's sci-fi novel series on sale at Amazon, written by Tim Frady. That's me. Oh, one other goof from that episode. In the very last scene where Superman is flying off, the image is reversed, causing Superman's S to be backwards. In the next episode, Tin Hero has a goof involving a seemingly magic hat. Just before Crook throws a lit stick of dynamite in a vault with Frank Smullins and closes the door, he tosses his hat in with him. The hat falls flat on the floor, upright. When Superman arrives, he looks in the vault with his X-ray vision, and he sees the hat is leaning with the top against the safety deposit boxes in a totally different position. Then, when Superman pulls the vault door off, you can see it laying upright again. And then when Superman walks in and retrieves the dynamite, the hat has changed positions again. Now, small goofs like this obviously don't hurt the watchability of the show, and you really have to pay close attention to see stuff like this. But it's fun to see how things can move around in between takes. It gives you an idea of how scenes are, or at least were, actually pieced together. And going back to when Superman arrives to save Frank Smullins, you hear that Superman flying sound effect for a very long time. It's like, is Superman just flying back and forth. I mean, surely you don't have that sound when he's just like hovering, so what is taking him so long? The episode Whatever Goes Up is obviously meant for laughs, and I love the ending, but I still found a couple of goofs. When Jimmy and Lois are being held at gunpoint, Jimmy pours the anti-gravity formula onto a nearby table. When the table floats up and then falls onto the bad guy, he drops the gun onto the floor into a puddle of the anti-gravity formula. Then in the next shot, the gun is shown on the floor that is now completely dry. Then, when Lois picks up the gun, the puddle of formula is back again.
Pull the gun on him, Jimmy. I'll get the police.
Now, the second goof, I believe, is that the gun conveniently waits until it's in Jimmy's hands before it starts to float. Before that, it was just laying in the puddle of anti-gravity formula, just waiting to be picked up. In the episode Tomb of Zaharin, the view of the airfield through the airport doors is obviously a painting. It's a good one, though. They used to do this a lot on the old shows, especially series that were filmed in front of a live audience. Now, this episode does have a great action scene. I always love seeing George Reeves knock down a wall. Reeves just loved knocking down walls, and who can blame him? In the episode Disappearing Lois, near the end, Lois, Jimmy, and Inspector Henderson are tied up. Next, the bad guy starts shooting at Superman. Notice that Superman is in front of Lois and Inspector Henderson. And it's a good thing, too, because bullets are bouncing off of his chest. I'm not sure if there was a time jump or what, but it cuts to another angle, and Superman's standing right next to Jimmy and Inspector Henderson. And if he were standing there when they were shooting, then Jimmy and Henderson would probably be dead. Lois Lane would have definitely been hit by a bouncing bullet off of Superman's chest, for sure. Let's go back to season 2. I missed a goof from The Big Squeeze, the episode that guest starred Leave It to Beaver's father, Ward Cleaver, actor Hugh Beaumont. Superman pulls the door off of Fur Vault to save Hugh Beaumont's character, Dan Grayson, who accidentally shut the door. Now, you can tell George Reeves is having to keep his hand on the door to keep it from falling. And he's just, I guess he's just trying to save the scene. But as soon as he has to take off, the door starts to fall, and you can see it falling just for a second. And then it's back to leaning against the wall, safe and sound, where Superman put it. I just have to wonder if that door actually fell to the ground in between shots. In the episode Atomic Captive, Jimmy and Lois get trapped in the middle of an atomic blast test. This episode goes big by taking on the challenge of putting Superman up against an atomic bomb. It's a visually impressive concept you'd expect from a comic book or a big budget movie. Unfortunately, they didn't really figure out how to make the resolution work out very convincingly, even though it was an exciting scene. In the episode, Superman is flying over the nuclear bomb explosion, and then he reverses the blast by waving his arms.
Why, it is Superman. He's reversing the explosion. He's driving it back into the ground.
There's no logical explanation as how this would work since Superman doesn't have magical powers. He's not waving his arms at super speed either. It's also conceivable they meant for us to think it had something to do with Superman flying around the blast at super speed, and the arm flailing was just Superman pushing against the blast. But I guess in the end, it's up to the viewer's imagination. Now, if you look carefully, you can also see parts of the apparatus holding George Reeves up in the flying position underneath his S. Not that noticeable, but it's there if you look hard enough. Also, when the actual nuclear detonation occurs, the car that Jimmy and Lois were driving is blown over onto its side by the shock wave. But they don't seem to be affected at all. Seems like a no-brainer. If the blast knocked a car over, it would have sent them flying as well. Still fun to watch, but definitely some puzzling stuff going on in this episode.
Will you marry me? What?
In the episode Superman's Wife, Superman pretends to marry a police lady in order to catch some crooks, but poor Lois Lane isn't in on it. Fun episode, but I have to ask about the ending scenes. Superman must save his fake wife from being exploded from sticks of dynamite, but first he stops to warn off an armored car, which doesn't make sense unless he didn't know about the dynamite. But then when he gets there, he lands well away from her, where he has to run to her, instead of landing right next to her, which would have been more convenient, if not as dramatic. If he did know about the dynamite, he could have just flew there first and put out the dynamite fuse. I know I'm nitpicking again, but you know. In the episode 3-in-1, we catch Noel Neill in an honest-to-goodness blooper that made it into the final cut. When Lois Lane is explaining to Superman how short-handed the planet is, she says Clark is missing, but then says that Mr. Kent is trying to get a hold of Jimmy to take him off the feature till Clark gets back.
But Mr. Kent's trying to get a hold of Jimmy, take him off the feature till Clark gets back.
I think she meant to say Mr. White is trying to get a hold of Jimmy. In the episode, The Magic Secret, Superman, Lois, and Jimmy are caught in a kryptonite trap in a hole where the walls are caving in. Superman, being zapped with kryptonite rays, is too weak to stop the walls or fly his friends to safety. So he puts Lois in a trance and levitates her to where she becomes a solid obstacle, blocking the walls from collapsing while Jimmy climbs out of the hole to turn off the kryptonite ray. I've always scratched my head on this one. How could the frail human body of Lois Lane hold back the walls that were powered by hydraulic pistons just because she was in a trance? Seems like it would have really hurt her neck something awful. I wonder if they had chiropractors back in the 1950s.
Well, I, for one, ain't going to stand for it. Superman, get me out of here!
I'm afraid you'll have to get out the same way Jimmy did, Miss Lane.
At the top, there is no logical reason for Superman to reject carrying Lois up, other than it was hard for them to film without using an unrealistic dummy. In the episode Divide and Conquer, the episode where Superman splits himself into two, Superman breaks a wall and is covered in white dust. Then he jumps on top of a bomb, covering him with even more debris. A moment later, he's completely clean. Now, this isn't the first time this has happened. Now, as cool as this scene is at normal speed, if you slow it down, you can see the blast happens in front of Superman, not underneath, and the case holding the bomb is still intact. There's a scene in this episode where Superman tunnels into a cave that uses animation. I think they should have skipped that and just went with the usual, like this. Here's a couple of goofs from the episode All That Glitters, the one where Jimmy gets hit on the head and dreams that he and Lois have Superman's powers. When Jimmy gets hit on the head with sandbags, Jack Larson's timing was off just a hair, making it kind of noticeable that he wasn't really hit on the head. When Jimmy and Lois land, Lois's shoes are changed out as to avoid Noel twisting her ankle, which is actually a very smart goof. A second later, her heels are high again. As Clark exits Perry White's office, he is wearing his hat. Once he enters the hallway, the hat is gone. Boy, if I just had a nickel for every time that hat disappeared and reappeared out of nowhere.
The Adventures of Superman.
We discussed the very first superhero to ever air on television and some super amazing facts you might not know. Now, of course, I'm talking about Superman.
Up in the sky! It's a bird! It's a plane! It's Superman!
It was played by George Reeves. The series started in syndication in 1952 and ran to 1958, while the 1966 Adam West Batman is considered to be the first superhero to ever air in prime time, even though technically Batman doesn't have real superpowers.
Holy bouncing boilerplate!
But just to be completely clear, Superman wasn't the first comic book hero to appear on television or sport high-tech gadgets like Batman. After all, we can't forget the Lone Ranger, whose show began in 1949 on television. I guess you can't really consider him a true superhero, even though he did wear a mask and fight crime. At the same time, though, if we consider Batman a superhero, then the picture gets a little bit fuzzy.
What the heck's he trying to tell us?
I don't know. Let's go up and ask him.
Especially when you consider that the Green Hornet is supposed to be the descendant of the Lone Ranger. Is the Green Hornet considered to be a superhero?
And what are you, Mr. Good Guy?
That remark will cost you an extra 10%.
There's also heroes that were very comic book-esque, like Captain Video and his Video Rangers. It ran from 1949 to 1955. And most of those episodes no longer exist, according to what I read on Wikipedia. This was one of those shows that didn't bother to save old episodes after the show aired. There's one shining example of Captain Video that has lived on throughout television history, and that's Ed Norton from the Honeymooners and his Captain Video helmet.
Calling all Space Rangers, it's time to blast off with Captain Video and his Video Rangers!
And then let's not forget Buck Rogers and Dick Tracy that both aired in 1950 to 51. Others would follow in the 50s like Zorro and Invisible Man. So, not counting those guys, Superman is considered the first comic book superhero to air on television. Definitely the first with superpowers. Why Batman counts as the first primetime superhero even without superpowers is possibly because he wears such a cool costume? I don't know.
Table, Batman?
Just looking, thanks. I'll stand at the bar. I shouldn't wish to attract attention.
So let's go over some interesting facts about the Adventures of Superman starring George Reeves, who was the first TV Superman, but not the first Superman. Now, Kirk Alyn was actually the first one to wear the cape on screen on the Superman movie serials of the 1940s. And then there was the Fletcher cartoons, of course, that came out in theaters in the 40s as well. But I digress. Let's just stick to the facts. Just the facts about the Adventures of Superman.
Just the facts.
The Adventures of Superman was sponsored by Kellogg's breakfast cereal.
Tony, tell the folks how Frosted Flakes taste.
Great!
The slogan, Truth, Justice, and the American Way, used on the show's intro, was first heard on Superman radio programs before the comic books used it during World War II.
Fights a never-ending battle for truth, justice, and the American way.
The pilot for Superman was a movie entitled Superman and the Mole Men, released to theaters in 1951. It became a two-part episode for the series later on. Cables and wires were used for Superman's takeoffs early in filming. During filming of the Superman and the Mole Men feature, the wire supporting Reeves snapped and he fell to the studio floor. Now, most of the flying scenes were taken by having Reeves lie flat with the film moving behind him. At the end of Season 1, cables and wires were discarded for takeoffs and later dropped altogether by Season 2's end. Later, a springboard was brought in for takeoff scenes where Reeves would run up, hit the board, and appear to be jetting off into the sky. Techniques for landing involve Reeves jumping off a ladder or holding an off-camera horizontal bar and swinging down in the frame. Jimmy Olsen actor Jack Larson, Lois Lane's Noel Neill, and Phyllis Coates would appear in other Superman productions many times over the years, like the Superboy TV series of the 80s and Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman in the 90s, and even the motion picture Superman Returns. The tone of the show went from dark and gritty to lighthearted and kid-friendly when color was introduced in 1954. When it was filmed in color, color TVs were pretty rare. Less than 1% of households had a color TV set by the end of 1954. George Reeves did appear in prime time in the Superman costume for a famous episode of I Love Lucy, where Lucy tells everyone that Superman will be at Little Ricky's birthday party. And when she fails to get him, she dresses up like Superman and gets stuck outside on the ledge. But lucky for her, Superman, George Reeves, comes out to rescue her.
How do you do? My name is Superman.
Lucy, what are you doing out there?
Do you mean to say that you've been married to her for 15 years?
Yeah, 15 years.
And they call me Superman.
And that's not the only connection between Superman and I Love Lucy. Dean King and Terry Hatcher did a special tribute to I Love Lucy on the Lois and Clark TV series with a dream sequence where Superman is Ricky Ricardo.
Lois, I think you got some splaining to do.
Uh-oh.
Ay, caramba! You spotted them!
More seasons of Superman were planned when George Reeves was shot in June 1959. Reeves was only 45. His death is still controversial to this day, having been ruled a suicide even though many suspect it was murder. In 2006, future Batman star Ben Affleck would play in Hollywoodland, a movie that depicted the story of Reeves and a fictionalized account of the investigation into his death. To the 1950s generation and beyond, George Reeves will always be the definitive Superman. Please comment and share your memories of George Reeves or watching Superman on TV, movies, or reading the old comic books. Please subscribe, hit the bell for future notifications of videos. Please don't forget to check out my new book, Liberty Ace. And thanks, and have a great day.
Don't miss the next thrill-packed episode in the amazing adventures of Superman.